Okay, you've also got two-story problems here, so let's take a look at 22. In number 22, it says the temperature in Minnesota was negative 8 degrees one day. And then it says this was 12 degrees less than the temperature in Indiana on the same day. In other words, Indiana was 12 degrees warmer or we can write it the other way and say Minnesota was 12 degrees colder. Degrees colder than Indiana. And what we're supposed to do is figure out what the temperature was in Indiana. Now this isn't a section about solving equations, so chances are we have to write and solve an equation here. So we're saying we don't know the temperature in Indiana. But what we do know is that Minnesota was 12 degrees colder and that the temperature in Minnesota was negative 8 degrees. Well, that's an equation we can solve using the same rules that we just used in the regular problems. Again, we would want to keep our variable on the left and a lonesome number on the right. So we see our troublemaker here is the 12. 12 is going to have to move. How am I going to move 12? Well, I'm going to do that by adding 12 to both sides. Why am I adding 12? Because I'm doing the opposite. That's this rule up here in red. Anytime I want to move something to the opposite side, I have to do the opposite. I did the opposite. What did I get left with? I got left with x, which is great because that's what all I'm supposed to have, is to have the variable alone on the left. And over here I have negative 8 plus 12, which is 4. So what does that mean? Well, remember, we were talking about the temperatures, and we were figuring out what the temperature was in Indiana. So the temperature in Indiana, based on me solving the problem, had to be 4 degrees that day. Probably this past winter.